I think the barrier that we've got, Joe, to deal with a lot of people who are not enlightened or as awake or familiar or understanding this information, it's a psychological barrier. It's not an intellectual one. Right? This is willful blindness. You know, a concept, a psychological phenomenon, which we're all capable of in different circumstances, where human beings turn a blind eye to the truth in order to feel safe, avoid conflict, reduce anxiety, and protect prestige and fragile egos. So we've got to deal with that, right? And we can see this happening, you know, historically, you know, this has happened in many different circumstances. Look at Hollywood and Harvey Weinstein, for example, right? People kind of knew, but they didn't want to really talk about it, or they didn't want to, you know. But eventually the truth comes out, and then we have to deal with the fallout of it. You know, the Catholic Church and child abuse, pedophilia, right? For so many people knew, but they buried their heads in the sand. We're dealing with a very similar psychological phenomenon. But the other phenomenon we've got, and I think we shouldn't underestimate it, is the one of fear, right? So just a few weeks ago, Isabel Oakeshott, who's a journalist in the UK, she had access to WhatsApp messages between the Secretary of State for Health and other people in the cabinet. And it was a front page of the Telegraph newspaper at the beginning of the pandemic. And one of those messages revealed, we have to frighten the pants off the public. Something along those lines, right? So they wanted to create this fear. And when you're under
to force compliance.
And when you're in a state of fear, psychologically, Joe, two things happen. One is you're more likely to be controlled, right? And that's what they wanted. But also it inhibits your ability to engage in critical thinking. And many people are still under fear. And and I'm a numbers guy. I think numbers are important. I think when I have conversations with patients, I want to break numbers down in a way that they can understand. So we all had a very grossly exaggerated fear. Many people did, maybe not you, Joe, but many people did, of the virus at the very beginning.
I did at the beginning.
Yeah. One survey in the US suggested that 50% of American adults thought that their risk of being hospitalized with COVID was 50%, 1 in 2. When the real figure at that time was about 1 in 100. In fact, I did a subsequent analysis in my paper, because a lot of my paper also focused on the fact of lifestyle and obesity and all those things we can do to, you know, improve our immune system. And at the very early stages, you know, Wuhan strain in the UK, looking at middle-aged people, the risk of hospitalization if you were an obese, sedentary smoker from a poor background, socioeconomic background class, was about 1 in 350, something like that. If you were active, not overweight, non-smoking, you know, healthy diet, all that kind of stuff, your risk of hospitalization was almost 4 to 5-fold less, so 1 in 1,500.
Wow.
Yeah, massive difference. So again, that reinforces...
That is not the way it was described.
No, not at all. But those figures are important, because without understanding the numbers involved, the public and doctors are vulnerable to exploitation of their hopes and fears by political and commercial interests. And that's what happened.
What do you think history is going to look back on this and learn? How is this going to be viewed? Do you think that the full narrative is going to get... Because this is an extraordinary time. Because in this extraordinary time, there's options available like this podcast, where you can go on and you can say these things and they'll be received by millions of people, and articles will be written, and different shows will take clips from this and discuss it, and it can change narratives. Do you think there is any hope that something like this, which was such an event where I don't know what the full numbers of people worldwide who were administered this, do you know what the numbers are?
I don't off the top of my head, Joe, no.
But it's billions.
Yeah, 100%.
Billions of people.
Yeah.
When we look back at this in the future, is this a cautionary tale? Is this something that you think they would like to do again and again and again? Because the profits have been extraordinary. Like the profits from this has probably been the most profitable thing the pharmaceutical drug companies have ever been involved with, if you talk about a time duration.
$100 billion Pfizer have made from this vaccine, which in my view should never have been approved for a single human.
Not even old people? Not even...
So, great question.
Yeah.
Great question. So I think there is a case to be made, Joe, at the very beginning, during the original strain, the Wuhan strain, when it was particularly terrible, that the older people over 70s and the vulnerable may have had more benefit than harm. I think that there's a good case to be made there. Okay?
So is this all vulnerable people, older people, plus obese people? What about people with immune systems that were compromised already?
Yeah, so the only problem with the immune systems that are compromised already is that for the effectiveness of a vaccine, you need to have a reasonably good functioning immune system.
Right.
So people who have compromised immune system, it's a very gray area about how much benefit they get. But let's just for argument's sake, say yes, that the benefits outweighed the harms in those groups.
Okay.
I think that becomes irrelevant when you've got a serious adverse event rate which is so high, which normally wouldn't, irrespective, even if the benefits outweigh the harms. And also, what about the informed consent side? So let's say, for example, we calculated that actually your benefit from the vaccine in preventing you being hospitalized with COVID was, say, 1 in 200, right? But then I said to you, Joe, so your benefit's about 1 in 200, but the harms seem to be, at least early on, so the short-term harms are 1 in 800, at least. Now, we can make it individual choice. But my guess is, in my own experience with patients, even with that information where there's still, you can argue the benefits outweigh the harms are so significant in terms of numbers that most of those people, Joe, would choose not to take the vaccine. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
Yeah.
And then also there's this false narrative that was repeated continuously during the beginning, which was this was going to stop the infection. This was going to stop you from getting others sick. You were going to do this for other people, and this was going to get us out of this. Because everybody desperately wanted the pandemic to be over.
It was a psychological manipulation.
And there was also the emergency use authorization in America, where they were allowed to distribute this vaccine with no liability. They didn't have to worry at all about being sued for adverse side effects, and they essentially silenced any talk of any sort of alternative treatment. Because if there is a treatment that's offered, there's an effective treatment, then they no longer can justify the emergency use authorization. Is that correct?
Absolutely.